Before I start, the most important thing to mention is that everything we did that night was meant to be a joke. Just some harmless fun. We had no idea what was going to happen, and if we had known, we never would have gone through with it. Unfortunately, things didn't turn out that way. My friends, let's call them Sam and Alex, and I were trying to figure out what to do for Halloween. We were all 16 years old and figured we were too old for trick-or-treating. But we didn't want to just stay home either. Halloween fell on a Saturday that year, which meant our curfews were later than usual, giving us more time to do something exciting. The idea we came up with was pretty mean, but at the time we thought it would be funny. Looking back, it was just cruel. We lived in a large suburban area, and not far from us was a woman we all knew as the neighborhood hoarder. She didn't just hoard stuff inside her house. Her entire yard was piled high with junk, at least 6 feet tall in some places. No one saw her much, and when reporters tried to interview her about the mess, she always declined. We figured she was probably ashamed of how her home had ended up. Our plan was simple. We'd sneak around her house and knock on the doors and windows, rattle the doorknobs, make spooky noises, anything to scare her a little. I know this sounds mean, and I wish I had a better excuse for our actions, but I don't. Once it got dark, I met up with Sam and Alex, and in costume, we headed toward her house. People asked what we were dressed as, and the only thing we could come up with was thieves, since we were all wearing black clothes and had stockings pulled over our faces. We looked ridiculous, but I should have been more concerned about what we were about to do. When we got to her yard, the smell hit us immediately. It was a mix of garbage and something worse, like decay. I almost threw up and begged the others to leave, but they just told me to suck it up. We tried looking through the windows to see if she was inside, but the windows were blocked by more junk. We could hear a TV, though, which was enough to convince us she was home. Sam came up with the idea that we should each go to different windows around the house and start knocking. I made my way to the backyard, which was an absolute nightmare of trash and rotting food. I hated every second of it, but didn't want to chicken out and ask to leave again. I got to the sliding glass door at the back of the house and started knocking. Through the trash, I saw some movement inside. Slowly, Emily, I'll call her that, came into view. I hadn't seen her in years, and she looked terrible. Not just unwell. She looked sick. Her skin was pale, and she had dark circles under her eyes. She had gained a lot of weight, and her clothes were filthy. She looked like she hadn't bathed in a long time. I stood frozen for a moment before realizing I needed to hide, but my feet were stuck in the garbage. No matter how hard I tried to move, I couldn't free myself before she spotted me. Then I heard a knock at the front door, and she turned toward it. I was relieved. Alex snuck over to me, asking what I was doing. When I told him I was stuck, we both started to worry. Sam came over too, and the two of them thought it would be funny to leave me there to see if she'd catch me. Some friends they were, right? They knocked on the back door and ran, disappearing from view. I watched as Emily made her way through the mess inside her house, heading toward the door I was stuck near. She opened the sliding door, and when she saw me, she smiled this eerie smile, like she was pleased to find me there. She let out a giggle like a child on Christmas morning. Before I could react, she grabbed me with surprising strength and dragged me inside. I screamed, telling her I was sorry and begging her to let me go. I kept looking back at my friends, hoping they'd do something, but they just stood there, watching, too scared to move. She pulled me through her house, which was even worse than her yard. The smell was unbearable, and the floor was covered in filth. She sat me down on a filthy old couch and looked at me with a strange, motherly expression. I was gagging from the stench, and before I knew it, I threw up all over myself. She spoke to me in a babyish voice, saying, "Oh, sweetie, you made a mess. Let mommy clean you up." I was terrified. She went into another room and came back with a rag that was just as dirty as everything else in the house. She wiped my face and clothes, but the smell of the rag made me vomit again. She didn't seem to notice this time. Instead, she sat next to me and pulled me onto her lap, cradling me like a baby. I tried to get away, but no matter how much I struggled, I couldn't break free. I just kept begging her to let me go. After what felt like an eternity, she put me back on the couch and left the room again. When she returned, she was holding the body of a dead cat. She placed it in my lap, saying it liked me and wanted me to pet it. There was no way I was going to touch it. Finally, after what was probably only 30 minutes, I heard police sirens. Relief washed over me as they knocked on the door. When they asked if anyone else was inside, she told them no, just her baby. They insisted on checking, and when they finally saw me, they told me to come with them. Emily didn't want to let me go, though. She stood between me and the officers, screaming that they couldn't take her baby. One of the officers warned her, but when she wouldn't move, they tasered her. She fell into the trash, and they were able to arrest her and get me out of the house. At the hospital, I had to shower to wash off whatever filth I had been covered in, but I was physically okay. Emily was sent to a mental health facility, and her house was condemned and eventually torn down. I haven't heard anything about her since, but I still think about that night all the time. Part of me feels guilty. If we hadn't messed with her, none of that would have happened. But another part of me wonders if, in a way, we helped her by getting her the care she clearly needed. Still, it was the worst Halloween I've ever had, and by far the scariest. Halloween has always been one of my favorite nights, even now as an adult. But nothing compares to celebrating it as a kid. Those were the best times. I try not to think too much about the night I'm about to share, but my therapist suggested writing it down might help me move past it. So, here I am, trying to work through a night that's left me with endless nightmares and fear. I hope some of you will understand why it affected me so deeply. I was 17 years old back then. For context, I'm 5 feet 2 inches and have always been pretty small. I've been the same height since I was 16, and I still wish I could grow a bit taller. That Halloween, my friends decided we were too old to go trick-or-treating, which really disappointed me. So, when we were figuring out what to do instead, my friend Sarah suggested we hang out with her boyfriend and his friends. They planned to walk around, scaring kids and doing other silly things I didn't want to be part of, but I was pressured to come along. I was told if I didn't, one of the guys wouldn't have a girl to hang with, and I'd be selfish if I bailed. So reluctantly, I went along. We were all still dressing up that year, and I chose to be a character from my favorite show at the time, which let me wear a cute, comfortable outfit. Sarah, on the other hand, had picked a sexy bunny costume, which, as teenagers, felt a little much. Honestly, they shouldn't have even sold her that. I met up with my friends and the guys, and we started walking around town. To be honest, it was boring. Fewer kids seemed to be out trick-or-treating that year, so the guys' plan to scare people didn't really work. I wasn't complaining. I didn't want to ruin anyone's fun night. At some point, we made our way to the house of an older guy Sarah's boyfriend didn't like much. He said he was just going to prank the guy by ringing the doorbell and running. Of course, it didn't turn out that simple. We walked past the house, and suddenly, he picked up a rock and threw it through the window. He yelled for us to run, and as we fled, I glanced back and saw a figure in the broken window. A person dressed as Michael Myers from the movie Halloween. It was creepy, but I figured it was just a coincidence since, well, it was Halloween after all. Once we reached the end of the street, we slowed down, and I caught my breath. I started yelling at Sarah's boyfriend for pulling such a reckless stunt. He then mentioned seeing Michael Myers in the window too, calling the guy a freak for just wearing the costume inside with no kids around. Everyone laughed it off, but when I looked back at the house, I saw him again, standing perfectly still on the lawn, staring at us. I turned to tell the group, but just like in a horror movie, when they looked back, he was gone. I've always found Halloween to be a pretty scary movie, so seeing someone who looked just like the character from that film watching us didn't sit well with me. Even after we turned the corner, I kept looking back, half expecting him to be following us, but he wasn't. A few minutes later, we stopped at a fast food place to grab something to eat. I was munching on fries when I looked across the street at the nearby movie theater, and there he was, standing under the light like he wanted me to notice him. I didn't look away this time. I pointed him out to the others, and Sarah's boyfriend yelled at him to leave us alone. But in true Michael Myers fashion, the guy said nothing and just tilted his head as if confused. Then he started walking toward us, slowly but surely. Sarah's boyfriend kept shouting at him, but as he got halfway across the parking lot, we all panicked and bolted. Sarah and her boyfriend ran one way, the other two guys followed them, and thankfully, my friend Emily stayed with me as we ran into a nearby neighborhood. After several blocks, we stopped to catch our breath and made a plan to head to Emily's house. We agreed to alert each other if we saw him again. As we walked through the neighborhood, we saw nothing suspicious, just a few kids still trick-or-treating. That is, until a little boy coming from a nearby house pointed behind us and said, "Cool Michael Myers costume." Emily and I exchanged terrified glances before turning around to find him just 5 feet behind us. We screamed and ran all the way to Emily's house, not stopping until we burst through the door. Through tears, we explained everything to her mom, about the prank at the house and the guy following us. She wasn't too happy about the rock-throwing part, but she found the story about the Michael Myers guy kind of funny, thinking it was some elaborate Halloween joke. We didn't find it funny at all. A little later, as we sat in our pajamas, her mom peeked out the window and chuckled, saying our friend was still standing on the sidewalk outside. Fear shot through us as we looked out and saw him, standing there, staring at us. We started crying again, begging her mom to take it seriously. Once she realized how scared we were, she sent Emily's dad outside to tell the guy to leave. Thankfully, the man walked off. We thought that was the end of it. But later, as Emily and I were trying to sleep, we heard a knock at her window. We were too scared to look, so we got her dad. He pulled back the curtains, and there he was, Michael Myers, standing right outside, staring in. He didn't even flinch when Emily's dad confronted him. We screamed and ran as her dad stormed outside to confront the guy again. The police were called, and they arrested the man. As it turned out, he wasn't the guy whose window had been smashed. He had no connection to the house at all. In fact, when the police went to the house, they found the real homeowner had been strangled to death. The man who had been following us confessed he had planned to do the same to us, but didn't expect Emily's dad to be there. He was sentenced to life in prison, so I no longer have to worry about him. But the memory of that night still haunts me. I hope, one day, I'll be able to find peace and move on. Despite everything, I still love Halloween, just not the movie. Halloween has never been my favorite night, not even close, but I deal with all the spooky decorations and horror movies every October because my wife, Amy, loves the holiday. I do anything to make her happy. Every year, we hand out candy to the kids in the neighborhood, and we dress up in goofy couples costumes. It's fun for her, and I can't deny that I enjoy it a little too. We live in a really nice neighborhood. Amy and I are both lawyers, so when it came time to buy a house, we made sure to get what we wanted. On Halloween night in 2010, Amy and I were dressed as Mario and Luigi from the Super Mario games. She insisted, and I thought it was hilarious. We even dressed up our baby as Yoshi. Handing out candy to the neighborhood kids was fun, and it was always amusing to see their costumes. Things had always gone smoothly when we handed out candy, but that night would be very, very different. Around 9 p.m., Amy opened the door, expecting to hear trick or treat. Instead, there was a little boy, about 8 or 9, crying on our doorstep. Amy knelt down and tried to ask what was wrong, but he was barely speaking between sobs. He said he was lost and needed water. She asked where his parents were, but he didn't answer. She brought him inside and led him to the kitchen for water, signaling me to follow her into the living room. Once there, she told me she was going to call the police. I agreed but suggested we let the boy calm down a little first and try to get his parents' phone number. After we talked, we went back into the kitchen, but the boy wasn't sitting at the counter anymore. Instead, he was standing at the back door. We didn't think much of it, figuring he might just be curious about the backyard. We brought him back to the table and asked if he knew his parents' phone number or if there was anyone we could call for him. He had stopped crying by then and said he didn't know his parents' number but did know his brother's. He made the call, and within 15 minutes, his brother arrived. The brother was sweaty and clearly worried. He told us they had been out trick-or-treating, and in just a moment of looking away, the boy had vanished. He thanked us repeatedly, and we watched as they walked off down the street, disappearing into the night. After they left, I mentioned to Amy that the brother didn't really look like him and seemed much older than 14, which is the age he said he was. We thought about calling the police anyway, just to be safe, but ultimately decided not to. Our baby had started crying, and we were already dealing with enough that night. The boy was with his brother now, so we figured he'd be fine. Amy was still a bit uneasy, so I spent the next few hours reassuring her that everything would be okay. By midnight, we were in bed, with our baby sleeping in the crib beside us. Amy kept saying how well the night had gone, but admitted she still felt unsettled about the boy. Around 3 a.m., Amy shook me awake. She said she heard something downstairs and felt like someone was in the house. Just as she finished speaking, I heard the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. I whispered to Amy to take the baby into the bathroom attached to our bedroom and lock the door. I went into our closet and quietly shut the door behind me. My heart was racing as I fumbled with the code to the safe where we kept the gun. Finally, I opened it, took out the gun, and stayed as silent as possible. I hoped Amy had her phone with her and was calling the police. I cracked the closet door just enough to see into the hallway. A man in a terrifying clown mask opened the bedroom door and stepped inside. He walked straight to the bathroom and tried the handle. That was all I needed to see. I slowly opened the closet door, aimed the gun at him, and with a shaky voice said, "Stop, I'm calling the police. Get out." He didn't seem to realize I had a gun because he turned around quickly, like he was about to charge at me. But the moment he saw the gun, he froze. I made a mistake by standing with my back to the door. Suddenly, I heard a voice behind me. "Put the gun down," it said. I glanced over my shoulder, and to my shock, the boy from earlier was standing there, pointing a gun at me. My mind was racing. I knew if I put my gun down, I wouldn't be able to protect myself, my wife, or our baby. I always knew I'd risk my life for my family, and I couldn't let them down now. I decided there was only one option. I had to take a chance. I fired at the man's leg, and as he fell to the ground, I quickly turned and tackled the boy, wresting the gun from his hand. Thankfully, I had been right. The kid was too shocked and scared to shoot me. Amy was screaming from the bathroom, asking if I was okay. I shouted back that I was fine. The police arrived within 5 minutes, as Amy had been on the phone with them from the moment she locked herself in the bathroom. It turned out the boy had unlocked our back door earlier in the night so his father could come in and rob us. The brother was actually his dad, who had sent him into our house to make the job easier later on. The father was convicted of home invasion and sentenced to 18 years in prison, where he still is today. The boy was placed in the care of his mother, who had been trying to gain full custody due to the father's criminal history. A month later, Amy and I moved out of that house. We stayed with her parents for a while before finding a new home. We just didn't feel safe there anymore. Our son is 12 years old now, and thankfully he was too young to remember that night. But Amy and I remember it all too well. We make sure to lock every door and window before going to bed, every single night. Halloween night on a boat might not seem like the ideal way to spend the evening, but my boyfriend really wanted to go, and I'm terrible at saying no to him. We were supposed to wear costumes, but I was already dreading the night without having to deal with an itchy, uncomfortable outfit. I only agreed to make him happy, but the night turned out much differently than we had planned, or than I had hoped. We arrived at the docks about 30 minutes early to make sure we got on the boat. They were selling tickets on site, so if you showed up too late, you couldn't go. Once we boarded, the boat was packed, and people were already drunk and acting out. I was not looking forward to the night ahead. Being an introvert, I felt completely out of place, while my boyfriend, who was incredibly outgoing, was in his element. Thinking back, he should have known how uncomfortable the night would make me, and maybe we could have done something we both enjoyed. But with him, it was always about what he wanted. Most of the night, I just sat at a table waiting for it to end. My boyfriend abandoned me the moment he saw one of his friends. We were about a mile off the coast, and I had nowhere else to go. To make things worse, the boat suddenly stopped. The lights went out and the music stopped too. People started booing like it was part of the show, but I knew something was wrong. I asked the crew what was happening, but they didn't seem to know either. Drunk, bored people are the worst to be around, and some thought it would be funny to try and rock the boat by running from side to side. It swayed a bit, but they didn't succeed much. The captain made an announcement that they were trying to get help from the Coast Guard, but hadn't had much luck getting through to anyone. He told us we might be stuck for a while. It started getting chilly, and I couldn't find my boyfriend anywhere. It was so dark that the only things visible were the glow sticks people wore and the occasional phone screen lighting up. I sat down toward the front of the boat, with nothing to do but wait. That's when a man sat next to me. He wrapped his arm around me, reeking of alcohol, and asked why I was sitting alone. I pushed his arm off and tried to walk away, but he didn't like that. He grabbed my wrist and yanked me back down so hard that I thought I'd broken my tailbone when I hit the metal deck. He laughed and said I'd be staying with him for the rest of the night. I was terrified but tried to remain calm, thinking the night would end soon. I was so scared I could barely move, so I just sat there while he held me. Eventually, my boyfriend found me and asked why I was sitting with another guy. I tried to explain what happened, but he didn't believe me. Instead of helping, he accused me of cheating and walked away, leaving me in shock. The man holding me seemed to take this as a sign that I was now his, saying I was single and telling me I'd be going home with him that night. He stood up, grabbed my waist, and whispered in my ear, "If you try to get away again, I'll make sure you don't leave this boat." My heart was racing, and I knew I had to find a way out of this. As we walked through the crowd, I decided to make a run for it. I pushed him away and sprinted through the sea of people, dodging anyone who might slow me down. I found the women's restroom, ran inside, and started crying. The other women there asked what was wrong, and I told them about the man who had been following me. Moments later, he burst through the door, looking for me. Without hesitation, the women in the restroom tackled him to the ground. It was so dark that I couldn't see much of what was happening, but his groaning and screaming made it clear he wasn't enjoying what they were doing to him. They punched and kicked him until he was unconscious. As they were dragging him out, the lights on the boat flickered back on, and everyone gasped when they saw the scene. His face was barely recognizable, and his clothes were torn. His body was red and swollen from the beating, and I knew he'd be covered in bruises by the next day. The captain finally managed to contact the Coast Guard and the police using someone's cell phone. We made it back to the docks quickly, where the police were waiting. The women who had helped me were questioned, and I was too. Other passengers backed up my story, confirming that they had seen me struggling with the man but hadn't intervened. The man was taken into custody after being treated at the hospital. He was charged with harassment but only got 90 days in jail and a small fine. He was also ordered to stay away from me and not contact me. He never admitted to what he did, denying everything and even threatening to sue me. Fortunately, the witnesses and evidence were enough to prove my side of the story. I broke up with my boyfriend the day after the boat party, and we haven't spoken since, for obvious reasons. What I'm most thankful for is the women who saved me that night. They didn't hesitate to help me when I needed it most, and I'm still friends with many of them. Every Halloween, we get together and have each other's backs, just like they did that night. I used to work at a laundromat, which can be unsettling enough on its own. We offered laundry services, and you wouldn't believe some of the things customers brought in. Stuff so dirty that burning it would seem like the only option. More often than you'd think, we'd have to tell people to come back for their dirty clothes because we simply couldn't or wouldn't wash them. Yet, they always returned and washed their items themselves in the machines. As long as I didn't have to touch it, I didn't care. The story I'm about to tell is one that still baffles me. It happened on Halloween night in 2008. We were supposed to close early, but my boss decided that staying open late might attract more business. He figured being the only laundromat open on Halloween would bring in customers. I don't think he would have thought that if he had to stay, though. So, instead of closing at 6 p.m., we stayed open until 11 p.m. My boss left around 7, gave me the keys, and told me to lock up when I left. I expected it to be a slow night, but it wasn't. A lot of older people came in, saying they appreciated the late hours on Halloween since it meant fewer kids running around. By 10 p.m., everyone was gone, and I didn't think anyone else would come in. About 20 minutes before closing, a man walked in. His clothes were torn and filthy, and he smelled of alcohol and possibly weed. I try not to judge, so I told him he wouldn't have time to dry his clothes before we closed, but was welcome to use the washer if he didn't mind leaving with wet clothes. I would have stayed late for him, but I promised my husband I'd be home to help put the kids to bed, and 11 p.m. was already cutting it close. I wasn't sure how to react when he pulled out blood-soaked clothes from a black garbage bag. And I don't mean dried blood. These clothes were dripping wet with fresh blood. I stared at him, wide-eyed, and he must have noticed because he turned and asked if we had any bleach, saying he was a butcher, and these were his work clothes. He bought some bleach, and all I could manage to say was, "Aha!" As he loaded the clothes into the washer, I watched the water turn a deep red as the machine churned. When the cycle ended, I was relieved it had only taken about 10 minutes past closing. I was ready to go home, but when he pulled out the clothes, they weren't clean at all. He came up to the counter, practically begging me to let him run them through again. That meant staying another half hour with this suspicious man, but I felt like I couldn't refuse. I didn't believe the butcher story and asked him again where all the blood came from. This time, he changed his story, saying it was fake blood he'd bought from a Halloween store for a prank he was playing on friends. He claimed it accidentally got all over him. I didn't believe that either, but I didn't let on. I agreed to let him wash them again. He started the washer, added more bleach, and this time the water ran clear. Then he asked if I wanted to hear a scary story. God knows I didn't, but I felt like I couldn't say no, so I said, "Sure." This is what he told me. A man was walking down an alley late at night when he felt a strong urge, one he'd had for years but had always suppressed. This time, though, he couldn't resist. He had to satisfy the craving. If he didn't, it felt like something inside him would die. This man had always been fascinated by death, even as a child. He used to dissect animals and was obsessed with serial killers, often imagining himself as one. Killing animals never felt like enough, and as he got older, he constantly thought about moving on to something bigger. One night, he was walking through the city and spotted a woman standing on a street corner. She was clearly a sex worker, and he asked if he could buy her services and take her to a secluded alley since he didn't have anywhere else to go. She agreed, and as they walked into the alley, he noticed an old metal pipe lying near a dumpster. He picked it up and struck her in the back of the head. She fell unconscious, blood pouring from her wound. Entranced by the sight of the blood, he sat beside her, rubbing the blood on his face and clothes. He cradled her head in his lap, watching the blood flow, feeling a thrill he couldn't describe. At that point, I told him to stop because the story was making me sick, and thankfully he did. Not long after, the washer buzzer went off, and he packed up his still pink, wet clothes and left. I locked up quickly and rushed to my car, relieved to get away from the laundromat that night. The next morning, when I arrived to open up, police officers were waiting for me. I immediately knew why. They asked if a man had come in with bloody clothes the night before, and I told them everything. They explained they had tracked him using security footage from street cameras. It turned out the story he told me was true about himself. The woman he attacked had been found not long after and was barely alive, but she survived and was expected to recover. The man, however, hadn't been caught yet, and I haven't seen him since. I keep an eye on the news, hoping he's never able to hurt anyone else, but deep down, I fear he might. One thing's for sure, I will never work late on Halloween night at a laundromat again. I've been living in Ashford, Alabama, and have been listening to your show since Christmas last year, but I guess I missed my chance to send this in before. It's about an old friend of mine, Jason, and how we lost touch over the years. The story starts on Halloween night in 1996, so I think about it every year around this time. It's kind of a sad tale, but many spooky stories have that touch of sadness because those terrifying things always come with consequences, and rarely do they end happily. Jason and I grew up on Linden Street, on opposite sides of the First Methodist Church. We were best friends all through elementary school. Once we hit junior high, we became a tight group of four. Me, Jason, a kid named Aaron who lived on Briar Lane, and then Zach, whose parents owned the diner on West Main Street. We were inseparable, whether at school or hanging out on weekends, especially Saturday nights. This includes the night of October 30th, 1996. We were all excited to go trick-or-treating the next evening, but like every Saturday, we walked around gathering the crew from each other's houses. Usually, we'd walk through the neighborhood, maybe stopping by the baseball field on Harrison Street or exploring some old abandoned houses. But since it was the night before Halloween, we had something different in mind. We were talking about haunted places around Ashford, deciding which ones were the creepiest. There was the old Carter place, where Mr. Carter had passed under strange circumstances, and there were always stories about weird sounds at night. His house was way out of town, though, so we didn't feel like trekking there that late. Another option was the old train yard, which people swore was haunted, or even the Ashford Cemetery, but someone mentioned the dilapidated house on Blake Avenue. That house was a two-story colonial style with big windows and a crumbling porch. It had been abandoned as long as I could remember. I don't think it was ever a plantation house, but its owner clearly wanted it to look grand. By 1996, it was nothing but a decaying mess, full of termites and cobwebs. It looked like the kind of place that should be haunted, even though we'd never heard any actual ghost stories about it. That probably drew us to it, the mystery. It felt safer than the cemetery or train yard, like a place where nothing bad would happen. We couldn't have been more wrong. We walked down Linden, crossed Parker Avenue, and turned onto Blake, talking about what might have caused the house to be abandoned. Zach speculated the family that once lived there had a tragedy. Maybe the father lost his mind and killed everyone. Aaron thought something else must have happened, like a terrible accident that trapped spirits in the house. We tossed around theories, but the truth was none of us knew why it had been left to rot. By the time we reached the house, our confidence was starting to fade. The place looked far spookier at night than it ever did during the day. We had talked about exploring it, maybe finding hidden treasures or uncovering some dark family secret. But now, standing in front of it, none of us felt brave enough to step inside. That's when Zach dared me to go in. I remember saying, "No way, not alone." Then he dared Aaron, who also refused. But when he turned to Jason asked, "What do I get if I do?" After some back and forth, Zach offered a deal. For every minute Jason spent inside, he'd get one handful of Zach's Halloween candy haul the next day. Jason accepted, saying he'd bring back something from the house to prove he'd gone in. We watched Jason cross the overgrown yard to the porch. The steps creaked under his weight, and he stepped through the doorless entry. He looked back at us, nodded to Zach, and flicked on the lighter he'd borrowed from Aaron before disappearing inside. That first minute felt like an eternity. I half expected Jason to jump out and scare us, but he didn't. When the second minute passed and then the third, we began to worry. By the time we hit 5 minutes, Zach walked toward the house, shouting for Jason to come out. There was nothing, just silence. We were getting nervous. Zach yelled again, but still nothing happened. It was nearing 10 minutes when we started to feel real fear. All three of us were near the porch now, calling Jason's name. Suddenly, we heard movement from inside. Zach called out, "Jason, is that you?" No reply, just slow, steady footsteps coming toward the door. We backed away, scared that something horrible was about to come out of the house. But when the figure stepped into the moonlight, it was Jason. He looked fine, no injuries, no sign of fear. We all breathed a sigh of relief. But when Zach asked him what had happened, Jason just walked past us without a word. We followed him, asking over and over what he saw inside, but he kept walking, silent. Finally, I ran in front of him and saw tears in his eyes. When I asked what was wrong, Jason suddenly snapped. He shoved me away, yelling, "Leave me alone!" His voice cracked like he was on the verge of sobbing. I'd never seen him so angry or upset. He stormed off and we didn't follow. The next day, I called Jason's house to check on him. His mom said he wasn't feeling well, and he didn't join us for trick-or-treating. He stayed sick for about a week, and when I finally talked to him, he told me never to ask about what happened in that house. He said if I did, we wouldn't be friends anymore. We never spoke about it again. Jason was never the same after that night. A year later, his family moved to Orlando. We lost touch, and years later, I found out he'd passed away, overdosed on heroin before he even turned 40. I don't know what he saw in that house, but I'm convinced it stayed with him for the rest of his life. In 2014, I was 14 years old and had just had an amazing night out with friends trick-or-treating. We knew it would likely be our last time doing it together before we all got too old. We lived close to each other, and on our way back, we took turns walking one another home. I was the last one walking alone after we got to Kelly's house, and she went inside. She offered for me to stay over, but I knew my mom wanted me home since it was a school night. Our town was small enough that our parents weren't too worried about us being out by ourselves on Halloween. We were just glad we wouldn't have to deal with the embarrassment of parents tagging along all night. After Kelly closed the door, I started walking down the street, hoping to make it home before my 10 p.m. curfew. Normally, it was 9 p.m., but my mom let it slide for Halloween, which I was thankful for. As I walked down the dimly lit street, I started hearing something from the bushes beside me. I looked over but couldn't see anything since I didn't have a flashlight. I sped up, but the noise kept pace with me. It was a growling sound, and no matter how brave I tried to be, I felt like a little kid wishing for my dad to come save me. Eventually, my fast walk turned into an all-out sprint. I heard branches breaking, and the growling became barking. By the time I reached the end of the road, I realized it was a large, intimidating dog following me. It looked like a pit bull, but what terrified me most was its size and the fact that it was baring its teeth and growling at me from behind a short fence. It felt like the dog and I had a moment where we both realized the fence wasn't very high. I swear we made eye contact, and I knew exactly what it was going to do next. I yelled at it, "No, don't," like it could somehow understand me. But, of course, it effortlessly jumped over the fence and charged toward me. I took off running, but I knew I couldn't outrun it. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I climbed onto a parked car and screamed for help. I'm not sure if anyone heard me or if they just thought it was a Halloween prank, but no one came. The dog kept jumping at the side of the car, and I was desperately praying for the car alarm to go off and bring someone outside. But just my luck, the alarm never went off, and I was stuck. I was crying, hoping my family would realize I was late and come find me. I was ready to wait on top of that car all night. Then the dog discovered it could jump into the truck bed to get closer to me. It hopped right in, and before I knew it, I slid off the car and was running down the street again. The cape I was wearing started slowing me down, and it was choking me as it pulled at my neck. I threw it off, hoping it might distract the dog, but it missed. Then, I spotted a tree that looked easy enough to climb. I ran for it, and like I was in some action movie, I managed to scramble about 10 feet up in seconds. The dog was still jumping at the base of the tree, but at least I was safe for the moment. Despite everything, I still had my priorities straight. I clutched my bag of candy the entire time. I was even prepared to tie the bag to my back to make sure I didn't lose any. I sat in that tree for what felt like forever, though it was probably only an hour. The dog eventually stopped barking and just sat there, staring up at me. I knew it would be a while before my parents realized I wasn't home, so I started eating my candy, staring right back at the dog. Strangely, I began feeling bad for it. I knew my parents would want something done about the dog once they found out what happened, but I didn't want that for it. Right then, I made up my mind to get out of the situation without anyone having to hurt the dog. I thought about jumping down and running home, but I knew the dog was way faster than me, and the times I'd outrun it were just luck. I needed another plan. After sitting there for a while longer, I finally came up with an idea. The tree I was in overlooked a fence into someone's yard, and right near the fence was a window. I figured if I threw my candy at the window, it might wake up the people inside, and they could distract the dog long enough for me to escape. I didn't want to lose my candy, but I cared more about saving the dog from whatever my parents would do. So, I tied the candy bag into a ball, took a deep breath, and threw it as hard as I could at the window. The window shattered, waking up the people inside. They came out, and as soon as they opened their door, the dog ran toward them. That was my chance. I climbed down and sprinted home. I got home just as the police were arriving. I had missed my curfew by 3 hours, and my parents had already called them. I had no choice but to explain what happened, but when they went looking for the dog, it was nowhere to be found. The couple whose window I broke told the police the dog had run off after they went back inside, and my parents had to pay for the damage. I never saw the dog again, and honestly, I was a bit relieved. I know some people might think the dog should have been found and taken care of, but I've always believed it's the owners who are responsible, not the dog. There isn't really a moral to this story, just a random, unavoidable experience. I'm just thankful I managed to climb that tree. Let me start by saying, I'm not one of those people who thinks kids shouldn't have treats on Halloween. When I was a kid, I used to hate the people who handed out apples or crackers. It was always such a letdown. One year, though, I was working so much that I completely forgot to buy candy until the actual day of Halloween. By the time I got to the store, everything was gone. The only things left were bags of pretzels shaped like ghosts and spiders. I was so annoyed with myself, but I didn't have any other option, so I bought them to hand out to the trick-or-treaters that night. Throughout the evening, I apologized to every kid who came by, promising that next year I'd have the best candy. Surprisingly, no one seemed upset, and a few kids even told me they liked pretzels, though I think they were just being polite. It was all going smoothly until about 10 p.m. when I opened the door to a group of teenage boys who were far from pleased with the pretzels I gave them. I was shocked when they started insulting me, calling me names and complaining about the pretzels. One even demanded money for ruining their Halloween by not having better candy. After hearing about 5 insults, I just shut the door in their faces. As they walked away, one of them kicked my door, yelling, "You'll regret this." I didn't think much of it. They were just some angry teens, and I figured they'd move on. I turned off my porch light to signal that I was done for the night and settled on the couch to watch some scary movies. A couple of hours later, while watching Halloween, I heard a loud crash at the front of the house. When I went to check, I found a rock had been thrown through my window with a note tied to it saying, "Do you regret it now?" Honestly, I laughed a little because it seemed so over the top. I put the rock and note on the counter, grabbed a tarp to cover the window, and tried not to think too much about it. We were expecting some rain the next day, so I wanted to make sure nothing got inside. But when I heard another crash from the bedroom side of the house, I started to feel uneasy. There was another rock, this time with a note that said, "You fat pig, we're gonna kill you." This time, my stomach dropped. This wasn't funny anymore. I called the police, but they told me they were overwhelmed with calls and might take a while to get to me. They said to call back if the situation got worse. After covering up both windows, I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. A little while later, my car alarm went off. I didn't dare go outside, so I went upstairs and looked out the window. My windshield was smashed in, and the rest of the car was trashed. I couldn't believe that these kids were doing all this over a bag of pretzels. Suddenly, bricks and rocks came crashing through every window in the house. One barely missed my head as I stood by the window, watching the chaos. Glass flew everywhere, and I started screaming. It was like the entire house was under siege. I was terrified. I called the police again, begging them to come quickly. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I looked outside and saw my neighbors coming out to see what was going on. I yelled for them to call the police and get back inside. Then, as I rushed downstairs, I saw them, the same group of boys from earlier. But this time, they weren't just talking. They had bats and ropes with them. I ran back upstairs to my bedroom and locked the door, but it didn't stop them. They broke through the door like it was nothing, charging at me while yelling and laughing like it was some sick game. They beat me mercilessly, all while shouting insults and laughing. I remember feeling numb as the blows kept coming, but it was the laughter that disturbed me the most. They were enjoying this. The next thing I knew, everything went black. The police arrived later, finding me curled up on the floor, bruised and bleeding. They called an ambulance and I was rushed to the hospital. That night, I ended up with 8 broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, torn ligaments, cuts all over my body, and a fractured skull. The doctors said I was lucky to survive with no internal injuries or brain damage. I spent months recovering in the hospital and eventually had to move in with my mom while I healed. Fortunately, those kids were dumb enough to brag about what they did at school. They must have told the wrong person because someone went to the police with the information. In the end, 8 boys, all between the ages of 14 and 17, were arrested and charged with home invasion, attempted murder, and assault with a deadly weapon. They were tried as adults, and their sentences ranged from 12 to 25 years. Some of them made deals in exchange for lighter sentences by testifying against the others. I was relieved they got what they deserved, though I had little hope when they were first arrested since they were minors. I fully recovered physically, but I'm still dealing with PTSD from that night. I'm just thankful to be alive to tell this story. Safe to say, I don't hand out anything on Halloween anymore. I don't even open my door. I'm not taking any chances of going through something like that ever again. On October 9, 1977, the parents of 19-month-old Nina Louise Carter put her to bed and kissed her goodnight. The Carters lived in Lawton, Oklahoma, a city of about 90,000 people in Comanche County, which was originally settled on former reservation lands of the Comanche and Apache tribes. Lawton was established in 1901 and named after Major General Henry W. Lawton, who fought in the Civil War and was later killed in the Philippine-American War. The city's landscape is typical of the Great Plains, with flat terrain and gently rolling hills, while the area to the north is marked by the Wichita Mountains. Although Lawton's economy is still largely reliant on Fort Sill, the city has grown to include higher education, healthcare, retail, and manufacturing industries. Nina's father, George Carter, worked in manufacturing. After laying their daughter down to sleep, George and his wife Rose retired to their bedroom for some rest. But when they woke the next morning, they stepped into every parent's worst nightmare. Nina's crib was empty, and she was nowhere to be found. They immediately contacted the police, who arrived at the Carters' home, took statements, and conducted a search. The main focus was figuring out how the intruder got into the house. After a detailed inspection, the police came to a disturbing realization. The windows in Nina's room were still locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. The terrifying conclusion was that the abductor had likely entered the home during the day and hidden in Nina's closet until her parents were asleep, then quietly slipped out of the house with the child. Nina's disappearance shocked the community. The police urged people to be alert and report anything suspicious. No one could understand why someone would kidnap a 19-month-old baby, but everyone hoped she was still alive and being kept somewhere. A month later, a group of children exploring an abandoned house just 4 blocks from the Carters' home made a horrifying discovery. Inside the dilapidated kitchen, they opened a refrigerator and found Nina's suffocated body. Lawton had seen its share of crime, but the abduction and murder of a child was unheard of. However, this wasn't the first time something similar had happened. Just a year earlier, on April 8, 1976, twin sisters Mary and Tina Carpenter were abducted in broad daylight while watching TV at their grandmother's house. A teenage girl, Jacqueline M. Rubidoux, dragged the 3-year-olds away after coaxing them outside. Despite witnesses seeing the girls struggling to free themselves, Rubidoux managed to escape with them. 2 days later, a group of kids playing in an abandoned house heard faint noises coming from a refrigerator. When they opened the door, Tina Carpenter fell out, alive but traumatized. Her twin sister, Mary, was not so lucky and had died from suffocation. When questioned, Tina identified Rubidoux as their abductor. Despite being implicated, Rubidoux wasn't charged due to a lack of physical evidence. The case quickly stalled, but suspicion lingered. Shockingly, by the fall of 1977, Rubidoux had regained enough of her reputation to be hired as a babysitter again, including for the Carters. George Carter vividly remembers the morning of Nina's disappearance, describing the cold October air. He and his wife searched everywhere, even the most unlikely places, but their daughter was gone. Detectives initially considered George and Rose as suspects, given the high rate of parental involvement in such cases, but both passed lie detector tests. Suspicion then turned toward local babysitters, including Rubidoux. It wasn't until someone recalled Rubidoux's involvement in the previous year's case that detectives began focusing on her again. When questioned, Rubidoux provided an alibi, claiming she was at a bingo game the night Nina disappeared. While this initially held up, Detective Cecil Davidson grew increasingly doubtful. Rubidoux's odd behavior, such as avoiding eye contact and acting evasive, made Davidson believe she was hiding something. However, without any physical evidence, no fingerprints, footprints, or other forensic clues, the case against Rubidoux remained circumstantial. Despite Davidson's strong belief in her guilt, Rubidoux was never charged with Nina's murder, leaving George and Rose Carter to live with the haunting what-ifs of that night. George later expressed his torment over the unanswered questions, wondering if they had only checked on Nina when she cried. Perhaps the abductor, likely hiding in her closet, could have been caught. Years later, George remains unsure if Rubidoux was truly responsible. He recalls that Nina always greeted Rubidoux with a hug when she came over, but an interview with Rubidoux revealed she had been using drugs at the time. George still questions whether someone close to them was involved, but he can't shake the feeling that Rubidoux's involvement in both cases was more than a coincidence. His wife, Rose, passed away in 2000, leaving George to carry the burden of knowing that no one was ever held accountable for the loss of their daughter. As time passed, the investigation grew colder, and the hope of justice faded. Even though many believed Rubidoux was guilty, no one could ever prove it. Today, George is active in his local church, but he still struggles with the pain and the unanswered questions surrounding his daughter's tragic death. The memories of that night, the crying, the missed opportunity to check on Nina, continue to haunt him. One of my earliest childhood memories is going trick-or-treating in the neighborhood where I grew up. I didn't have a proper costume because I only decided at the last minute to join my older brother. I had always been scared of all the little monsters roaming around on Halloween, but that fear was eventually outweighed by the promise of loads of candy. My mom used some leftover makeup to paint my face like a skeleton, and I wore an old, torn-up trash bag like a kind of garbage ghost. I must have looked pretty silly next to the other kids in their Batman and Superman costumes, but I didn't care. All I wanted was candy, and there was plenty of it. My brother was 14 at the time, and he agreed to take 8-year-old me around with him and his middle school friends. I couldn't believe I had been so scared, because being out there, knocking on doors and showing off our costumes, was some of the most fun I had ever had. People were handing out tons of candy, and not just candy either. One house, which I think belonged to the local dentist, gave us toothbrushes, and then laughed at our disappointment before handing out real candy. Another house gave us little Charlie Brown comic books. But there was one house where a man told me to open my candy bag. He dropped something small and white inside before walking off. I didn't realize Halloween could be like Christmas, only spookier. By the time my brother and I got home, Halloween had already become my favorite holiday. The next thing I remember, my mom asked us to dump out our bags of candy at either end of the kitchen table. Her plan was to take 3/4 of what we had gotten and put it away so we wouldn't eat ourselves sick. But when she saw what I had in my pile, she immediately freaked out. She pointed at one particular item and asked me, "Where did you get this? Who gave this to you?" I didn't know, which only made her more upset. She kept pressing me to remember who had put it in my bag. I started crying, and then cried even more when my mom called the police, saying this was an emergency. 30 years earlier, when my mom was a child, all the kids in town went trick-or-treating. One girl, around my mom's age, went out with her friends and came back not only with candy but also with a little white doll made of fabric scraps. Her mother thought it was harmless and let her keep it, but a few days later, there was an incident at a local park. The girl's mother had taken her to the park, where the kids played on the jungle gym. While the kids played, the mom noticed a man standing by the fence. She assumed he was just a parent or grandparent watching his kids, but then she saw him get her daughter's attention. The man called her over and spoke to her. The mom didn't think anything of it at first, but then she saw the man reach out and ask for her daughter's hand. When she saw her little girl give him her hand, the man leaned down and appeared to sniff it. Alarmed, the mom walked over, told her daughter to get away, and asked the man what his business was talking to children. The man didn't say a word and just walked off. When the mom asked her daughter what the man had said, the girl couldn't explain. She said she didn't understand him, but somehow she knew to go to him and give him her hand. The most disturbing part? The little girl said it was the same man who had given her the white doll while she was trick-or-treating. The girl's mother was horrified and immediately contacted the police. But by the time they got involved, the man had disappeared. A few days later, another little girl went missing. Her mother had gone to wake her up for school, only to find her bed empty. The police searched her room and found a small white doll, just like the one the other girl had received, hidden under her pillow. Despite a massive search, the missing girl was never found, and the man who had given out the dolls vanished without a trace. My mom never forgot the story of the missing girl and the strange white dolls, and that's why she panicked when she saw a similar doll among my Halloween candy. She immediately called the police, and the entire town went on high alert. The police figured it was some kind of sick prank, maybe a teenager who had heard the old story and wanted to scare people. They didn't believe anyone was really in danger, but for days, no one let their kids out of sight, just in case. Nothing happened after that, and life went back to normal. But my mom was shaken, and it brought back a lot of bad memories from her childhood. Even though the police were sure it was just a prank, my mom couldn't shake the feeling that something worse could have happened. I didn't hear the full story until years later, and while I think it was probably just a prank, sometimes I wonder, if the person hadn't chosen my candy bag, would another kid have received that doll and gone missing? My name's Chris, and I grew up in a small town where some stories never go away. This might sound a little hard to believe, but I wouldn't share it if it wasn't true. It was easily the scariest night of my life, and I'll never forget it. I was 18 years old and just starting to accept that I'm gay. I won't dive deep into that, but it's important to the story. I had just come out to my parents, who thankfully accepted me. The day before Halloween, I told my group of friends. A few of them gave me weird looks, but most of them were happy for me and hugged me. I felt overwhelmed by the love and support I got during such a vulnerable time for me. The next day at school, we were figuring out what to do for Halloween. Some people were having parties we could go to, or we could hang out at one of our houses and watch scary movies. I had just been through some emotional days, so I wasn't really excited to go out, but my friends insisted. They told me I should have fun being my true self after hiding it for so long. I appreciated their support, so I agreed to go. We ended up going to a party, and everyone there was so kind to me. It was like nothing had changed, and I was relieved. We left the party around 1 a.m., and one of our friends, Alex, suggested we head to the woods to visit the old abandoned farmhouse. It was one of those spots teenagers went to hang out or smoke, so we had all been there before. But now it was nighttime, and I just wanted to go home. Most of our friends decided not to go, but Alex kept pressuring me to come, saying he was having so much fun and wanted me to join him. I looked at my best friend, Sarah, and told her I'd only go if she did. Sarah agreed, so the three of us headed to the farmhouse. We got there fairly quickly, and by around 2 a.m. we were inside the building. It was still in decent shape, not falling apart, so I felt somewhat safe. Alex pulled out a Ouija board from his backpack and started laughing like a villain in a bad movie. There were 5 of us there in total, and he asked who wanted to play. I'm pretty superstitious, so I wasn't about to touch that thing. Sarah and the others decided to play while I stood off to the side and watched. Alex started asking dumb questions like, "Will I get laid tonight?" And "When will I die?" It was all silly, and you could tell he was moving the piece himself to get the answers he wanted. At one point, he asked the board when he would die, and it gave a date hundreds of years in the future. He started bragging about how he was immortal or some nonsense. I tapped Sarah on the shoulder and told her we should leave. I was surprised when she said she was having fun and didn't want to go, that I stayed for another hour before the others were finally ready to leave. As we were walking out, Alex stopped me and said he had forgotten his backpack inside, asking if I could grab it for him. I didn't think much of it, so I ran back in to get it. But just as I was about to walk out, I watched as Alex slammed the door shut. I tried opening the door, but it was blocked from the outside. The rest of the house was boarded up, so I had no way out. I pulled out my phone, but of course there was no signal. I started yelling for him to let me out, but all I heard was his laughter and hateful slurs. He told me I didn't deserve to live and that he hoped I'd die in there. This was exactly what I had feared, that people would hate me just for being who I am. I started crying and shouting for help, but we were deep in the woods, far from anyone who could hear me. About 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps upstairs. My heart raced, and I felt like something was watching me. The farmhouse was nearly pitch dark since I didn't have a flashlight, and my eyes hadn't fully adjusted. The footsteps grew louder, coming down the stairs and getting closer. I curled up in the corner of the room, trying to stay hidden. The steps stopped right in front of me, and I could hear someone breathing. Suddenly, a voice said, "It's not nice to summon spirits in someone's home." I looked up and saw a man standing over me. He looked homeless, wearing dirty clothes with matted hair, and he smelled awful. I almost screamed. "I'm sorry, sir," I said. "My friends were doing that, not me. I'm really sorry." He didn't seem too angry, but there was something unsettling about the way he spoke. "Why are you in my house?" he asked. "People are always coming here, and I hate it. I don't come to your place and mess around. I'd leave if I could," I told him, "but my friend locked me in." Then he smiled, showing a few missing teeth, and said, "You're not leaving. You're mine now. I'll keep you here as punishment for all the times people have trespassed." My heart pounded as I scrambled to my feet and pushed past him, knocking him over. I ran up the stairs, hearing him chase after me, yelling that I belonged to him. I made it into one of the bedrooms and saw an open window. The jump to the ground was high, but I had no choice. I leaped out and hit the ground hard, likely breaking something, but the adrenaline kept me moving. I limped home as fast as I could. When I finally got there, I banged on the door until my mom answered. I lost my keys and phone, but I was just glad to be safe. I hugged my mom tightly, unable to stop crying. She asked what had happened, but I couldn't explain through my tears. She told me to take a shower and calm down, then we'd talk. After cleaning up, I noticed my ankle was in serious pain. I told my mom we needed to go to the hospital. On the way, I explained everything. She was heartbroken, not just because I was hurt, but because she knew this happened because of who I am. I ended up with a broken ankle and had to wear a cast for 2 months. My mom reported Alex to the school, and though he wasn't arrested, he was expelled, which was a relief. No one ever found the man from the farmhouse, and the building was demolished a month later. It's been years since that night, and I still get chills thinking about it. But I'm happy to say I've been living as my true self ever since. I'm married now, and we're expecting a child through surrogacy soon. I'm looking forward to raising someone who'll be a good person, and he definitely won't be staying out late on Halloween.